This is Saturday morning, and I'm recording the lectures that we'll need for next week. I'm going to continue to do this for this coming week. We've got the Progressives lecture and we've got the Imperialism lecture. I'm doing it for this week in part because I want to cover a lot of territory very quickly, and also because I'm going to be gone on Friday the 13th, and giving you a lecture check quiz is very, convenient. So this is what we're going to be doing. So we will talk about progressivism in the from 1890 roughly to 1920. I will maybe try to break this up into smaller chunks, I think. So we'll see. I'll try to watch the timer. So we're going to discuss the roots of progressivism. First off, the progressive movement, the Panic of 1893, questioned the industrial order. So if you remember back to what that was, with the unions and the strikes and that kind of thing, we begin to see that creates a great deal of frustration. This is when the Populist Party really starts to gain momentum. The Democrats really begin to be concerned. You begin to see the Republicans, through McKinley, begin to talk about maybe some moderated responses, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission. These things begin to be valid concerns. And so the Panic of 1893 really makes people sit up and pay attention. And the middle class really begins to pay attention to corruption and ask questions about, don't we need something more than just civil service reform? We need to address the political corruption in the cities and the influence of the big money at the national level. This is not a coherent single topic, but is a bunch of different reforms. So this could be, it's easy to talk about progressivism as though it's one gigantic kind of monolithic thing. However, progressivism could happen whether it's Jane Addams and the Settlement House movement, whether it's attempts to limit the influences of the party bosses at the city level, or the big national party bosses like Marcus Hanna. It could even be focused on things like, how can we improve education and make education more systematic and orderly? How can we influence the workers' world and make their life more systematic and orderly? It was a ton of different things, but at the end of the day, you can sum up progressivism as regulation and reform. How do we control and create efficiency? How do we make things nice and orderly? How do we limit the undesirable influences and the undesirable effects? The biggest other characteristic is going to be paternalism, the fact that the middle class knows what's best, and that they're going to set the system up according to their standards. Now, understand that sometimes that's very paternalistic. If you think back to when we looked at the Frederick Douglass document, and how Frederick Douglass he made this comment that, trying to take care of everybody wasn't always what everybody needs. Progressivism always struggles with that balance with, how do we regulate and control unintended consequences? How do we influence behaviors? How do we influence society without being so paternalistic that we, baby people or take away their freedom of choice and that kind of thing? So this is kind of one of those things that we wrestle with. And progressive movement wants to protect the middle class values in a lot of ways. The idea is that the environment is the strongest determinant. Those of you that are in my sociology class know that this determinant is, is going to be, to what extent does environment play, and how can we make that a better thing? So this is why sociology and the progressive movement are really tied hand in hand. So you see there's a lot of elements of sociology through the progressivism. They want real world results, rather than focusing on kind of these, philosophical debates. They want to see that there's actual results to what they're talking about. What are these interactions? What are these conflicts creating? John Dewey is one of the big ones. He focuses on education. He was kind of part of the Settlement House movement. and creating kind of an environment where these kids could begin to learn. Behaviorism, that we can shape behavior, time management studies, that law must be guided in the light of reason by Louis Brandeis. These are all having to do with the social context. So you can certainly see that the Supreme Court in the 20th century begins to be transformed by progressive ideas. Now, when we talk about the court packing scheme of the 1930s by FDR, he felt that there were a bunch of old men in place that were calling these things, the New Deal programs, illegal. But, and I do think that that's true, but I think that that's because some of the New Deal programs perhaps went a little far. So just understand that there's a whole range of progressive concepts, of progressive points of view, and progressivism is not one single idea. You can have lots of different progressives. You could have progressives that argue that we need to stop poor people from having babies, so forced sterilization is okay, to progressives that would say, oh no, we don't want to do that. Instead, we need to educate them and reform their environment and control the building codes. So that's kind of a very extreme example, or maybe not even really extreme, but a classic example of how progressives can range across the spectrum. And in modern concepts, if you look at progressives now, I mean, you can have progressives that are Green Party progressives, and you can have progressives that are Elizabeth Warren, kind of populist progressives that operate within the Democratic Party. And then you can have progressives that are kind of more along the Jeb Bush kind of Republican. And I know that some people would probably, their heads would spin around to say, I'm calling Jeb Bush a progressive. He's certainly progressive in view of some of your more extreme conservative kind of Tea Party type Republicans. So just understand that we still have this range of how do we feel about government intervention, government regulation. And so it's true then as it's true now. There's going to be lots of different opinions out there. So we're going to talk about lots of different things and kind of try to hone in on kind of what the commonalities are. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're looking at this. Progressive methods. Motivated by Christian ideals, in large part, this not to say that all progressives were focused on Christianity. Certainly in the modern era or the postmodern era of the 21st century, I don't know that Christianity necessarily has an impulse in progressivism, but I do think that the early 20th century was motivated by Christian ideals, that we have an obligation to help the poor and the needy, and that we have an obligation to help children. And, you know, you have to understand that the progressive era going into the 1920s, we don't have the emergence of fundamentalism that happens in the 1920s. And fundamentalism will be, you know, we can't teach about science, we can't teach about Darwinism. And so progressivism prior to 1920 doesn't have this conflict with, oh, well, we can't look at Darwin and the theory of evolution, right? This is something that happens because of fundamentalism in the 1920s. We see it resurge in the 1980s, and we certainly still talk about it now. I mean, now when we talk about things like birth control, you begin to have fundamentalist ideas that kind of make progressivism shatter into different groups. And so that was not really the case prior to 1920. So understand again, progressivism is not monolithic, and that fundamentalism will come in and kind of shatter that and split that up. And we don't have that prior to 1920. So when I say that it's motivated by Christian ideals, that is very true. And there's some nuances to the Christian ideals that we see after 1920 that, you know, just didn't exist then. They also they take with them this concept of organization and efficiency, and focus on management and control. Other parts of it, muckrakers. Journalists draw attention to social problems. Of course, if you think back to Martin's Passing of the Idle Rich, He looked at this very negatively because these muckrakers do throw these issues out there. And there's just as many different types of muckrakers as there are different types of progressives. Whether you're talking about Upton Sinclair, who is a classic socialist, right? Who writes about the jungle, who draws attention to working conditions and the quality of meat, to Ida Tarbell, who is not necessarily a socialist so much as she's a kind of let's regulate big business, kind of a more socialist Democrat, if you will, where she believes that democracy is still valid, but that we just have to kind of regulate everything, to muckrakers like Lincoln Steffens, who's going to focus on political reform. So just know that there's all different types of muckraking journalists, but by and large, if you're a muckraker, you are a journalist who's doing investigative work to call attention to the problems that are out there. And we still have muckrakers today. We just don't call them muckrakers, we call them investigative journalism. So you also have a big focus on volunteerism and collective action. And you have a variety of volunteer organizations that become very, very strong. Salvation Army. You're going to have women's groups, the YMCA. Some of these are going to be focused on, middle class women helping lower class poor. Some of them are going to be, let's collect money so that we can, create an organization that will pass out food to the poor or whatever. So it's just going to vary depending on what you're talking about. We're also going to be that we have municipal, state, and national organizations and agencies that are funded by some tax dollars, whether they're state, local, national. And they will take that money and they will fund these agencies to help solve some of these problems. Let's see. Women are a big part of the progressive movement. Middle-class, educated, urban women become the backbone of this movement. A lot of this has to do with the fact that in the early 20th century, women don't have the job opportunities out there that we see following World War I. World War I will be a game changer for women. Not only do women get the vote after World War I, but we're going to see that women will have increased job and educational opportunities. They'll also be much more have more social freedoms. World War I will usher in, once you get to the 1920s, once World War I is over, you're going to have the flapper, and you're going to have women that start drinking and smoking and working and dancing and having boyfriends and doing things that they had never done prior to that. Again, this is not like one kind of fixed moment. It's a transition. It's an evolution, right? So we're kind of going to talk in these big brushstrokes. Understand that there's going to be nuances, and it's going to vary depending on what year you're talking about. If you're talking about 1915, you're going to have a very different type of woman than you're going to have in, say, 1920. Or even if you consider the progressive movement to filter into like 1922, you're going to have a difference. A lot of these women, regardless of what year you're talking about, are going to challenge the Victorian ideals. They're going to challenge the Victorian ideals of that women only have sex to have babies. They're going to challenge the Victorian ideals that women should be very prim and proper and should, that they should only they should moderate their behavior, moderate their interactions. If you're a fan of Downton Abbey, there's a lot of examples from Downton Abbey about this, over what's appropriate for women to do, especially women of the middle and upper classes. And so I think this is very telling. Women like Margaret Sanger, who advocated for birth control, especially for the working classes. Her advocacy for birth control has a number of different components to it. You're going to have and this is kind of a side note, just to kind of give you the complexity of the situation. But understand that Margaret Sanger, she's going to talk about allowing women to control how many babies they have, because for poor and working class women, having too many babies not only creates more children that don't have proper care, don't have proper educational opportunities. But these women become very sick and run down because they keep having these babies, and they're not able to go out and have a job to contribute to the family income, to lift up the family and create opportunities for children. And so she's going to kind of look at men as being kind of in this kind of Victorian concept that men are, morally vulnerable, and they drink, and they're, can't control themselves sexually, so they're going to force themselves on women, and that's going to make unwanted babies. And so she sees birth control as a way of preventing that. And for the middle class women, she sees birth control as a way of allowing them to contribute to society. If they can control how many children they have, then they can focus their energies on raising very intelligent, very well-trained children who have lots of opportunities. There's going to be more money to focus on their education. These women, when they aren't having babies, can then contribute back to society. And so she sees birth control as the answer to doing this, not because she sees it as very compatible with Christian ideals, because she's not concerned about, that she's somehow stopping the development of life and that life is God ordained, but rather that God values life, whether it's an unborn child or whether it's a child that's already born or a woman's life, and that all life is equally valuable. And so that birth control and preventing unwanted pregnancies is a way of allowing women to value all kinds of life. And so for Margaret Sanger, because she's not a fundamentalist, a Christian fundamentalist, she's not going to view birth control as incompatible with her Christian ideals. And so she's going to start pushing for that. Ida B. Wells Barnett is a black female who stands up for black rights, for against lynching. And she also calls out that lynching is often blamed on women. And she says that's just not fair, and that's not true, that you can't say that lynching black men is going to protect white women, and that she really calls attention to this, this falsehood, and says, lynching is a product of economic concerns. And so by being this female muckraking journalist who attacks lynching, attacks race relations, focuses on this dynamic of, that white men would lynch black men to protect their white women from unwanted black attention, that this was all largely kind of a myth that was used to justify this level of violence. And so she's she's challenging these Victorian ideals. Alice Paul, she challenges these ideals, saying, that women should have the right to vote, that women are not these fragile creatures that can't handle intellectual and political involvement. And so she starts, fighting for women to get the right to vote. And she's quite a radical politically. And so she argues for this. And so I think that that these women really kind of embody what progressivism is all about. We're going to see, I'm going to go through the social gospel and questioning poverty, and then I'll pause this so that you can take a break and maybe not have to watch, an hour worth of video. So the social gospel movement is one that is tied very hand in hand with progressivism. It's based on the biblical ideals of charity and justice, Christian law, as it is applied to social problems. In other words, take care of the less fortunate, take care of the women and the orphans, the widows and the orphans. Take care, let the little children come to me, share your fishes and loaves, that kind of thing. So it brings out all these Christian ideals of charity and kindness and sharing and community, and it says we can apply this to social problems, that competition and unbridled competition, unbridled capitalism, unbridled free market, that brings out the worst in people. It brings out the worst elements of society, and then it's Christianity that can ameliorate that can make this kind of competition better without destroying it. Remember that in the background of progressivism is the alternative of socialism / communism, this kind of Karl Marx idea that emerged in the 1850s that was really popular in Europe and still is a big part of European politics, right? Most of our European partners, whether it's Britain, whether it's France, as much as France is a partner with us, Germany, those countries are all going to have kind of this social democratic background that's tied to socialism that has its foundation in Marxism. Now, kind of to help you understand, you need to realize that communism, as we see it in the Soviet Union, as we see it with Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, as we see it with Stalin in the Cold War, even as we see it manifested in whatever kind of bizarre format the Russian Putin kind of thing is developing now, which is not quite socialism. I'm not sure what it is, but it clearly has its roots in this kind of, communistic radical Bolshevism kind of idea. This is not the same thing as the socialism that we see in Britain and Germany and the socialism that came from Marx, right? That is kind of a twisted manifestation of that. And so if you have questions about that, you can ask me in class and I'll go into more detail. If not, just suffice it to say that social gospel is meant to be an alternative to political socialism that says that the government will regulate, the government controls certain major industries and distributes wealth through social programs. And so social gospel is meant to prevent social welfare by saying that we are Christians and we don't have to be forced by our government to take care of the poor and the needy. That's what the social gospel is all about. So it's meant to be compatible with our capitalistic free market, free enterprise system, that our free market system can operate and with only a minimal amount of regulation to prevent large trusts, to protect competition and protect fairness for businesses, that the social gospel that can then step in and it can guarantee the social aspect of it, the social opportunity, the equal opportunity, so that we can find a way to balance our political ideals with our economic realities. And, so this works hand in hand with Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, the idea that, that the man of wealth will then distribute his money during his lifetime to certain key programs. With this idea, you're going to have the middle class buying into this, and that the middle class will then create programs and projects and organizations that will then handle the problems of poverty and the problems of industrialization, the tenement housing, the lack of education, neglected children, et cetera, et cetera. And so the churches will take on these community projects. And so if you're looking at the Gospel of Wealth and Carnegie taking, saying a wealthy man needs to distribute the money, for the social gospel, the churches will then collect smaller amounts of money from the middle class and then compile that into one sum, and they will essentially kind of do the same thing that Carnegie's talking about doing. Of course, Carnegie's emphasis is going to be on art and literature and education through the libraries and, protecting that kind of cultural aspect, whereas the churches are going to focus more on direct assistance to the poor, teaching them, training them, job training, teaching them to live more cleanly. Because remember when we read from Rees that the idea was that a lot of these people in the tenements just didn't know how to live properly. They didn't know how to take care of their property. Or a tenement house or something like that. And so they focus a lot on that. So they're focusing on direct hands-on assistance. So it's a little bit varied from Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, but very much in keeping with that. And we still see this today. A big part of Sunnyvale's emphasis is on community service. And this is where this comes from. So in a lot of ways, Sunnyvale, for all that it's very politically conservative in a 21st century concept, you see the elements of progressivism in Sunnyvale today because Sunnyvale buys into this progressive social gospel mentality. Even though we don't necessarily always tie it to a church program, our community certainly has a number of agencies and a number of organizations that are built upon volunteerism. And so, Do the Hard Things is one that pops into my mind. Sunnyvale Education Foundation is another one. These are organizations that are meant to get people in our community to contribute in small amounts or in small ways to produce a larger impact on the society as a whole. Other groups that you may sound familiar to you now, Salvation Army. This is a Christian mission that has kind of a pseudo-military organization where they've got captains and lieutenants and all this kind of stuff. And they kind of focus on discipline. If you're a poor person or a recovering addict or somebody coming out of jail and you get plugged into the Salvation Army, they're going to focus on some discipline and teaching you and training you how to live and work and all that kind of stuff, even though they're providing practical aid to people. And so they're very much a Christian mission that focuses on that kind of stuff. If you ever want to donate money or clothing or anything, FYI, the Salvation Army is a better place to go because the Salvation Army gives that aid far more directly to the needy as opposed to Goodwill, which is actually while it's technically a nonprofit organization, they're also kind of function a little bit as a company, and they hire people and that kind of stuff. So my personal opinion is that the Salvation Army is preferable to Goodwill because it's all about direct aid. Anyways, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, was meant to help industrial workers in the urban poor with Bible studies, citizenship training, literacy training, group activities. The whole purpose of the YMCA, which of course now has gyms and workout centers and stuff, was that rather than having these industrial workers go hang out in a saloon and drink and get drunk and be a part of the party boss system and the political machine and get into gang activities, we can provide them with good, clean fun. So you can see where the YMCA still fulfills that mission with their summer programs and their rec centers and all that kind of stuff. So they provide all this kind of stuff. They were also low-cost motels with the idea that these young men that would travel from the country into the cities, that rather than letting them get plugged into the gangs and the saloon system, they could go stay at the YMCA very cheaply and avoid that kind of mishap. And you have black and white YMCAs. You're going to have a female version of the YMCA that focused on, child care and teaching women to be good mothers and education and skills for being a housekeeper or being a secretary or something like that. So just kind of interesting to know that there's a bunch of different ones. And you're going to see that a lot of people begin to question poverty and the social Darwin concept that poor people are poor because they're somehow lacking in something. What you really see is that questioning poverty through kind of this naturalism and realism in art and literature begins to see that the poor are victims of circumstance and social conditions. So art and literature, in addition to muckraking journalism, say the poor are poor because they can't, this deck is stacked against them. When you're born into that kind of tenement housing, how are you ever going to know anything differently? And so this is where we begin to see that social Darwinism is not seen as an acceptable answer for why there's this huge gap between the rich and the poor. And so if the issue is that what has society and industrialization done to the individual to make them suffer and make them get trapped in poverty, what can we do as a society to fix this? And so this is where you see that sociology becomes quite a big deal. So I'm going to stop this here and let you take a breath. And then the next clip will be over, we'll begin to talk about more specific things as opposed to these broad ideas.